is Amit Lev. I'm the head of the Israeli Trade Mission. With me is also Katlecho, who is leading the fintech sector. First of all, I would like to thank you everyone who joined us today. This is the first event that we are holding together with SABRIC and also with the Export Institute. I think it's something that there's a lot of interest in South Africa about cyber threats and attacks, and we would like, as a trade mission here and representative of a country that's gained a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge about cybersecurity and technologies, we would like, to expose more and to share the info with all relevant stakeholders in South Africa about cyber security in general. Before I start, this webinar will be recorded. We will send you for all attendees the recorded after that. If you have any questions, we will have a dedicated time at the end of the session for questions. So feel free to put up in the chat and we will try to address all the questions. We have today Arthur Goldstuck, who is the MD, one of the most renowned tech journalists in South Africa. We have Reuven Aronashvili, the CEO of SAI and one of the founders of the Red Team hackers in the IDF, one of the most famous cyber units in Israel, and Lavy. Sorry if I'm not saying right the surname, but who is leading the INCD, the cyber CERT, the Israeli cyber CERT, and also was the head of the cyber financial CERT. So it's really many years of experience today in this webinar. I would like to give Susan Pudigitter from SABRIC also to add a few words from your end, and thank you again for the partnerships and hope to see you in future events.
Right, thank you very much. Also a very warm welcome from our side to the panelists as well as the people on this call. It's a huge privilege to be able to co-host this event with the Israel Trade Office in South Africa. We really appreciate the opportunity, and we are excited as SABRIC to hear what the panelists are going to be sharing with everybody on this call. It's also very nice to know that it is a mixed group on the call, people from different industries and so forth. And whilst I can only speak on behalf of the banking industry, I would be very surprised if cybersecurity is not top of mind in most of the other industries as well, just given the times that we're in. So just a couple of comments from the banking industry. We most certainly as SABRIC and our members believe in collaboration. We do believe that together that we're stronger, and sharing knowledge and experiences is really a big benefit to everybody who wants to create resilience, in the cyberspace. So we see this as central to our strategy, and most certainly we do also acknowledge that criminals change their tactics all the time. And just as information sharing and sharing of best practices is an important strategy, so is the ability to be agile. And I'm looking forward to hear from the panel of experts this morning with regard to what criminals are up to these days, and specifically hackers, so that we can be sure that we are solving for the correct problems, and if need be, that we can adapt our tool sets and stay relevant all the time. So thank you again to the panelists for sharing your knowledge with us, and I trust that everybody on this call will have some very valuable takeouts to take home. Thank you and enjoy the session.
Thank you, Susan. And also a few words from our partner in Israel, Alon Shahag, who is the head of the cyber department at the Israeli Export Institute.
Thank you, Amit. First of all, good morning, everybody. I would like to say a lot of thank you to our panelists, of course, to Arthur for moderating this, and to Amit and Katlecho for working with us closely, and the Trade Economic Mission, of course, and working with the Israel Cyber Alliance at the Israel Export Institute for bringing business opportunities to Israeli companies, of course, in South Africa. It's a pleasure to having you here, and I wish you a very successful day. and a very successful webinar. Thank you. Oh, Amit, you're mute.
Thank you. So just before we're about to start, before I turn off my camera and give to the real experts to talk, we're at the Israel Trade Missions. We are providing scouting services for South African corporates in all sectors, in all segments, and also for cybersecurity. We did this process with several corporates in South Africa. The idea is to create exposure for you about what's going on in Israel, in every sector, specifically in the cyber. There's so many advancements and improvements all the time. So it's just for the corporates, a service, of course, no cost, just to give them understanding about what's happening in Israel. There's no obligations from the corporate side, but this is why we are here, to provide more information and knowledge about what's happening in the specific in the cyber industry in Israel. And if there is any kind of request to meet with one of the speakers or with other to find out about other sectors, we will be glad to support and help you. So again, thank you very much. And there was last week, there was the Experian breach in cybersecurity in South Africa. The first time we did a cyber event was the Liberty cyber breach in South Africa. It appears like every time we're doing a cyber event, there is sometimes a cyber breach. So first of all, we have no any kind of relationship with those attacks, just to clarify. But also, this is something that, we see in the numbers that South Africa has more than 500 attacks per hour in the country, the third most attacked countries in the world. So I guess there is a lot of discussions, and there's something that a lot of the audience will be interested to hear more about why it's happening and what are the next things to look for. So Arthur, the stage is yours, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Amit. It's a true privilege to be moderating an event with two people who are at the very cutting edge. You could call it the burning edge of cybersecurity, at that interface between those who are looking to attack cyber interests globally and those who are defending it. And these are probably the iconic defenders against the cyber threat globally, and of course in Israel. So it's going to be fascinating to hear their perspective on what threats face us, but also how to defend against those threats. And to introduce the topic more broadly, I just want to give you a perspective on the radical shifts that we are seeing in the digital landscape, which also therefore result in a radical shift in the threat landscape. Due to COVID-19, we are seeing digital transformation at a pace never seen before. Numerous of the digital or technology CEOs of the world have been referencing the fact that we have seen the same level of digital transformation in the first 3 months of COVID-19 as we would have previously expected to happen in the next 2 to 5 years. So in effect, we've seen almost a year of digital advancement or transformation happening in every month of the COVID-19 crisis, as organizations, governments, and the like scramble to prepare themselves for continuity of both businesses and government services. The result of that is that the public in general also has had to wake up to this digital transformation. In our research, we call it the digital awakening. Now, that digital awakening doesn't come hand in hand with awakening to the security threat and how to protect against that security threat. So we are seeing a simultaneous growth in each of the areas of digital activity with the growth of the cyber threat. So for example, digital banking is completely taking over from physical banking. We had a statistic from Nedbank recently in South Africa, where they said that coming out of lockdown, their foot traffic into banks was down 62% on what it was last year. Now, that is not a result of people avoiding banks because of COVID-19. We had already seen that impact previously. That is the effect of people shifting their banking behavior into the digital landscape. But the problem is that a large proportion of those people are not ready for the digital threats that go with that move. So we are seeing a massive escalation in phishing attacks, for example. The threat actors attempting to get into people's bank accounts, preying on their ignorance as a result of almost being newcomers into this digital world. We're seeing it in numerous other areas as well, where businesses are moving to digital processes and to remote working, but without having moved their security defenses to the same level of digital preparedness. So while their remote workers are now digitally prepared, their security systems are not as prepared. And the result of that is that we have seen massive breaches in the last few months in South Africa and globally, and we'll continue to see those breaches as the threat landscape evolves as well. And one last point I want to make is that the hackers themselves are not sitting idly at home. While they've been in lockdown, they've been working out how they can exploit this emerging threat landscape. So in that context, I'm going to first ask Reuven Aronashvili to give us his perspective. Now, the point I want to make about Reuven or Rubi as he prefers to be called very quickly, is that he is co-founder of the Hacker Red Team in the Israeli Defense Force. Now, for those who don't know, a Red Team is a team that is set up to test the resilience of an organization or operation by acting as if they are the threat actors. So it's almost like something out of a movie. And I would like to ask Ruby to give us a perspective of how what we see in the movie world in fact translates into the reality on the ground.
So hi everyone. Thank you for the question. It's an interesting question. You know, what we learned, I think, in the last few years is that everything that you see in the movies that looks like something that is very, let's say, imaginary in a way, or something that you can only see in movies, becomes reality very quickly. You see things very basic, like technology that is evolving, and things that are also, of course, the corresponding threats that you see in other movies, like Die Hard with the attacks on airplanes, which at the time looked like something really out of the reality. It's not something that we've seen. But today, that's something that is definitely considered to be a significant threat and something that is being taken into consideration, like remote controls on heavy transportation, like rails, airplanes, and ships, and similar items. Now, from my point of view, I think that the reality is much more interesting than what we see in the movies, because the movies are not always able to go to the level of depth that we are looking for. But there are very, let's say, different attacks that we see today in the market, but the majority of those are actually not that sophisticated. And that's maybe sounds a little bit, let's say, odd that I'm saying that. But if we look at it, you see that the basic things that are being exploited, and that's something that I find myself always laughing about the point, is that really the points are the basic items, the basic foundations. Those are password quality, those are network zoning, interfaces that are open and not closed based on firewall. I'm not even talking about the next generation capabilities. And the industry likes always to talk about 0 days or things that are very, let's say, sophisticated. But let's look objectively on most of the recent attacks that we've seen. You see a lot of things are actually repeating themselves, from basic phishing attacks, right? Either through the organizational infrastructure or through the personal infrastructure, which becomes more interesting today because, you're working from home. You don't have the protection level that you have in your organization because sometimes you have connect or direct internet connectivity there. Then you bypass also the email protection that you have from your organization, and I'm sending you something to your personal Gmail. That's something that is able to bypass the protection capabilities that you have in your organization, all the next generation capabilities, and then land directly on your endpoint. Now, of course, the organization can still react, can still identify that, but let's say the attack surface is becoming, let's say, more interesting from an attacker perspective and less protected when you talk, when you look at an organization like a protected environment in a way, when you take into consideration the email protection and the perimeter protection. So if you're asking me what is the one thing, right, that I would say that is really important to do at these times when we are working from home, when we are taking into consideration all the scenarios from the movies and so on, I would say let's go back to the foundations, back to basics. Password quality, hygiene on specific patch management, specific network segmentation and segregation, closing management interfaces, using multi-factor authentication. All of those items are quite basic. An organization should already follow those long time ago. And still, I can tell you, the majority of the attacks that we see today are actually exploiting those items one by one. This is my personal point of view here.
Thank you very much, Ruby. I'd now like to turn to Lavy Shtokhamer, who is Executive Director at the Israel National Cyber Department, or Cyber Directorate, rather, and also heads up the Israel National Computer Emergency Readiness Team. But what's interesting is that his background includes service in the elite technology unit in Israel. And anyone who knows about these elite units in that country will also have heard, for example, of Unit 8200, which is one of the units that has produced probably more CEOs of Israeli cybersecurity startups than any other operation. There's a book called Startup Nation, which tells the story of these startups and how many of them come out of these elite units. And the why that is so significant is that almost anyone coming out of those units has a perspective of the threat landscape that allows them to create operations and services that are at the true cutting edge of taking on the cyber threat and protecting organizations from these threats. So given that background, Lavy, I'd be fascinated to hear your perspective of how governments and national entities are taking on this new threat landscape and what that threat landscape looks like to them, because it has clearly shifted dramatically in recent years.
Right. So first of all, I want to say thank you for inviting me here. It's my pleasure. One word about the INCD. The INCD is the cyber agency, the national cyber agency in Israel, responsible of cybersecurity end-to-end. Regarding your question, and I want to call it with what Reuven mentioned, our expertise, I think most of our expertise and the state that we're staying right now, just the number that was published yesterday, 29, that is amazing, 29% of the investment in 2020 on the cybersecurity, domain was investing in Israel. 29% of the worldwide investment, which is amazing. And when we try to figure out what's standing behind it, it's for one, so amazing units within the army led by 8200 and others, Reuven, not only 8200, others that are very, very sophisticated as well. So that's the first thing that brings us the perspective of the attacker, the offensive and defensive operation and correlation between the both of them is something that is crucial and in order to gain and build the robust cybersecurity ecosystem. I think the third part of it, and this is what we're trying to build, is to bring defense, offense, and ecosystem and human capacity in order to build, for example, this is what we're doing in Beersheba. So in Beersheba, we brought the IDF, also the unit 8200, the offense perspective from the IDF, we as a government entity, the national CERT inside the park, and we invest a lot in order to promote the cybersecurity ecosystem. Because without the industry, without thinking ahead, without promoting innovation, we're going to stand behind the attacker. And as Reuven mentioned, and I want to agree to call it for what he mentioned, now we know for sure that the attacker nowadays are using commodity tools, nation state and cybercrime gang using the same tools. They're sharing the same tools with one another. They're using opportunities. So for example, if to take it to the ROI perspective, in order to gain access and conduct ransomware attack, I won't need to invest in buying 0 days, for example, which are very expensive. I will try to spray, look what fish I'm going to find, and then only then to deploy the ransomware. And in most of the case, the spraying part are the most effective ROI, because again, most of the organization are leaving their door widely open. So that's bring to also the mindset of the attacker that they don't need to invest in advanced persistent threat. They don't need to invest in 0 day. They don't even need to invest in building the expertise within the organization. They only need the right mechanism in order to find and use opportunity around the surface. That's my perspective regarding to that.
Thank you, Lavy. I'm going to stay with you for a moment because my next question ties in with a question from one of our audience members, who also is quite a well-known name in the industry, Craig Rosewarne, who runs an organization called Wolfpack Risk, comments that he agrees with Ruby's comments about companies getting the basics right first. He says that companies are rushing out to buy new technologies, but they're not mature on patching, change management. People are unskilled, and there's no proper log management and the like. That obviously leaves organizations very vulnerable to cyber criminals and the tools that they deploy. So that's the next question that I want to ask of both of you, but starting with you, Lavy. What are the primary tools that hackers and threat actors are deploying to take advantage of these gaps and vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I will try to give the perspective of what happened even nowadays. What are the main trends around the COVID-19? Because apparently it will stay with us for at least a couple of months. What we've seen for around the COVID-19 is few trends. First of all is what I mentioned earlier. In order to use this ecosystem and this opportunity, what happened around the COVID-19 is uncertainty. Uncertainty of ourselves as a civilian, uncertainty of the other side within the attacker, and uncertainty is the most valuable situation for attacker to abuse. Attacker abuse uncertainty all over the world. It starts from phishing attack. I have within my presentation an example from the NCSC that show a smishing attack allegedly come from the healthcare industry to the civilian, asking them to press a link that deploy malware. It comes on the aspect of the registration of malicious domain that equivalent with their name, with names that are relevant to COVID-19, like Zoom or other names that equivalent with this situation. And it bringing other people, civilians and organizations to be more naive regarding those threats and using the social engineer ecosystem that is built right after the COVID-19 in order to, and basically attacker exploit it. The other thing that we've seen, and it's more accurate to your question, we don't know anymore what is considered to be cybercrime, what is considered to be nation state. The attribution becoming to be much harder because of the fact that both sides are using the same tools. Both sides, in some cases, are sharing their TTPs. And both sides are, in some cases, try to look as the other one. So, for example, there are cybercrime that are using nation-state attack, nation-state tools in order to eventually to exploit vulnerability within the organization. But on the other hand, in some cases, nation-state attacks try to mimic the cybercrime and cyber gang TTPs in order to be more efficient and to have a better OPSEC. And with that, to add to this, the modus operandi that have been changed within the nation state of using opportunity instead of invest a lot in buying 0 day or invest in R&D of 0 day in order to get into a specific organization. So this whole ecosystem on environment of what considered to be cybercrime, what considered to be nation state is changing. We're seeing nation state deploying ransomware. We're seeing, for example, some cybercrime that are sharing tools with group like Lazarus, which is nation state as well. So I think what we need to understand as in a mindset of a CEO or CISOs, that in many times I hear them say, I'm not that interesting. I'm sure that all of us heard it many times. I'm not that interesting for a nation state. I'm not that interesting to organize cybercrime. I'm not that interesting, so leave me alone. Now we understand that if you're not that interesting, but you're exposed, you're an opportunity for the attacker. You're not the first goal or the first aim, but eventually when you're exposed, you come up within the scanning radar and you become a target because of the opportunity. And this is what all of us need to understand and need to understand, that we have to be at least much more secure than our neighbors. Because eventually, if we'll be better than our neighbors, so the attacker will go to our neighbor and not to our organization and our house.
Lavy, I've heard that so often. I'm not interesting, or I'm not important. Why would they target me? Now that is often a hangover from the world of cyber espionage, where people are warned that they're being spied on, and in most cases there's actually nothing to spy on. But when it comes to hacking, there's always something that they can get out of you. So Ruby, can you give us your sense of that? What tools are you seeing? Do you concur with what Lavy is seeing? Or are you being exposed to different kinds of tools or different approaches?
I will take even Lavy's answer and take it even to more extreme case. We see that things like APTs, right? Something that 3 years ago, everyone talked about APTs. Now we see that APTs became viral. So it's a little bit strange, right? You're saying that this is advanced persistent threat, something that is targeted against you. How can it be viral? But still, we see those are viral. So we see different organizations attacked by different, let's say, threat actors using similar capabilities, but those attacks are very targeted. So the affiliation model that you see today coming from groups of attackers that are actually generating infrastructure to attack, and then people that are actually activating those infrastructures. This is a very nice business model if you think about it, right? Unfortunately, they are working much better than we do, right? Because they are actually very good at what we do. And if you see the support level that you get today from a ransomware group, that's something that is quite amazing, right? They are very customer oriented. They are working with you and not against you. They want to help you with solving your issue. And that's something that is quite amazing. Another thing that I think that Lavy said, and I think that it's very important to mention that, I think that attribution will disappear from the world. It's irrelevant anymore, right? It's not, you cannot take, like in the past, you took a list of IOCs and you said, okay, now let's take those IOCs, check the organization, and we are able to vaccine the organization in a way, at least against this type of an attack. You see that the transformation during an attack, that means you identified something, you tipped off the attacker already knows that you're there, the infrastructure is changing instantly. So yeah, you go ahead, you continue with your investigation, you find a lot of IOCs, but the attacker is not there anymore, or at least not there based on what you see. And those are capabilities that we see that are evolving very rapidly. So you asked specifically about tools. We see that, tools that are supposed to be tools for the good guys, like, you take a Cobalt Strike as an example, right? The tool that we are using as well. You start to see those tools that are supposed to be offensive defense tools, that means using offensive capabilities for these defense purposes, are actually using by the bad guys. Again, that's something that Lavy said as well. So the government start to use cheaper capabilities because, a 0-day, that's something that is quite costly. You don't want to use it every time that you have an opportunity. So you want to use, let's say, more daily tools. And then you see a lot of similarities between organized crime, nation states, and also some individuals that are using the same capabilities or same tools. That's something that you see all around. So I think that today the capabilities that you can find online, only those are very good in order to demonstrate significant impact on the business. That includes ransomwares that, that's something that everyone is talking about lately. But just a minute before the ransomware, that's a new trend that we see from, let's say, end of last year. We see data exfiltration and then another extortion capability that you first take the data out, then you encrypt the environment, you ask for the first ransomware, and then after you're getting paid or not getting paid, there is a second wave of ransom in which they are going to threaten you that they are going to publish all of your information, and then you're exposed to GDPR regulation and other capabilities that will cost you more. So we see that the thinking process behind those attacks are actually being done in a very efficient way to actually touch the points, the pain points that you have in your organization, and actually leveraging the regulation against you. And that's something that, if you think about it, actually the GDPR, it's supposed to be, let's say, a way to preserve or to maintain in a way a good, let's say, benchmark or best practice for privacy. We see that actually it actually created a very interesting line of attacks that is quite new in the market. And now you can ask yourself, which is better, right? What is the better way to do that? And those are very tough questions. But just another point on tooling, just the last one. One thing that we have to remember, that the fact that the governments are working in the cyberspace, that's something that actually influenced the market in a very significant way. If you take 2 years back and you talk about the Eternal Blue, right? Something that was leaked from the NSA, capability that actually, I think that the accumulative damage for this specific one is billions of dollars, right? And you see that how a specific capability coming from a government can then be used by criminal operations, and actually that feeds the market on a continuous basis. So things started from 2011 from the Stuxnet, that we've seen several generations after the Stuxnet, and it goes every time that we find something that is leaked from each or one of the governments, and then becomes public knowledge. Then the gap that you have in the community or in the protection community, it's something that is quite significant.
Thank you, Ruby. Before I move on to the other questions, I'm going to deal with a couple of questions from the audience. And one of them is whether we have a cybersecurity agency in South Africa and how to contact them. Well, we do have a few options. So, for example, the Hawks, which is the popular name for the South African Police Services Directorate for Priority Crime Investigation has a cybercrime unit. And if you go to the SAPS, South African Police Services website, you'll be able to find the contact details there. But we used to have specialized units in the police that were disbanded some years ago because they were too successful in trying to bring down corruption. Fortunately, those days seem to be behind us, but the problem is that we still live with the fallout from the disarray caused by that. SABRIC itself is very involved, the South African Banking Risk Information Council. I've always got to get my acronyms right, but they have a cyber intelligence research group, for example, and they also coordinate information between the banking industry and the South African police services in terms of combating cybercrime. So SABRIC is actually a good starting point, in fact, to report any cybercrime relating to financial services, and beyond that, to go to the South African Police Services website. So I hope that answers that particular question. We could do with more effective cybercrime or cybersecurity agencies in this country. And Craig Rosewarne tells us that there's a site called alertafrica.com that provides free awareness and crime assistance for the public. They'll tell you where to go. A question from the audience that I would like to ask Lavy to address, because he obviously has to tell his government and his ministers who are not tech savvy what is happening in the threat environment. How do you describe safer security practices to the less technically inclined? If they don't know what an advanced threat really means, how do you translate it for them? How do you explain to them what needs to be done?
So that's a good question. And I think you have to develop this specific expertise, a very unique expertise. We all can see that in the report and metrics of our Security Operations Center, and that it brings to the CISO tables. That in many cases are not saying a lot. You're seeing the amount of alert that you get, you're seeing the amount of incident that you get, but without insight, what's standing behind it, without an efficient trend, and to understand what is the trend that is standing behind it. And in order to bring it to a level where you sit within around the table of the decision makers, and you want to explain what you're seeing, I think it's a matter of education. You have to, at the beginning, to present them the fundamentals, and then to educate them to understand more and more about the threats, about the mitigation aspect, about each and every one of the aspects within the cybersphere. In many cases, we use an example from the physical world. So, for example, with COVID-19, or for example, what we discussed earlier of why we need to invest in info sharing. This is a question that I've been asked in my previous role within the stakeholder. Why we need to invest in info sharing? We need to invest in info sharing because as same as the bad guys are investing in info sharing and sharing their tools, we have to invest in info sharing in order to understand what happened around us, what happened in the neighborhood, and to be more secure. And let's say on the COVID-19 war, to be immune regarding that specific threats. So again, it's education. It's using example from the physical world, and it's evolution until we're getting to a point. And here in Israel, it's happened many times where the CEO, even the CEO, understand the fundamentals of cyber. And he understands when we're saying, listen, we have a crucial vulnerability that we must patch immediately. He's understand what's considered to be crucial vulnerability, because and on the previous session, we explained him and give him his example from the field of risk assessment. Risk assessment regarding financial aspect is in many cases are very similar to risk assessment in an aspect of cybersecurity. So using word like and methodology like risk assessment, like ROI, how do I invest, what considered to be crucial and what considered to be not that crucial. I think that's I think the key point in order to eventually to share with the stakeholder the right picture.
Great. Then before I move back to Ruby, SABRIC just wants to clarify that they don't deal directly with the public. If you have a cybersecurity issue regarding your bank, you should approach your bank directly. And SABRIC supports the banking industry more generally and works with its partners in government to combat bank-related cyber threats. But your first port of call should be the bank itself, and then the other resources that we mentioned earlier. Ruby, back to you, in fact, related to the last comments from Lavy, how do you prioritize mitigation in an era where there are thousands of cybersecurity solutions? Where do you start, and what is more important and what is less important? Is there such a thing as a ranking of importance of security threats and solutions?
Yeah, so we've built a whole, let's say, Bible around that, right? Because from my point of view, that's one of the most important aspects of what you can do in the organization. So, you know, as a red team, you work and you identify the vulnerabilities. And then you're asking the question, okay, so what? Now what, right? I come from a very basic understanding that people understand consequences. You show in a very clear way, leave the technicalities aside, right? If you show a threat actor that is able to compromise the organization and practically demonstrate financial loss or reputational loss or something similar that you can then quantify, and again, I'm talking about actual numbers, then decision-making is very easy. That relates to what Lavy just mentioned about ROI. If I show you, for example, that you have a threat, that you have 40% likelihood for this threat to get realistic, and the potential damage is $50 million, just as an example. And you need now to invest 200K in order to mitigate that. That's a very easy question, right? Because you can calculate the risk, you can calculate the potential damage, and then you can answer, yes, no, I'm going to invest there, right? Now, when you have a situation, let's say a chaotic situation in which you're working based on, let's call it for a second, compliance, because compliance is something that is very important from my point of view. However, compliance is not security. Compliance is a framework. It's supposed to provide something, and we see ourselves in a lot of cases in organizations that are there just trying to tick the box, right? Saying, okay, here we are okay, here we are okay, okay. And then we are fully compliant. However, from security perspective, we are at the lowest maturity level that we can see. And that's something that is quite consistent in the market. We see that a lot. So my point here is that if you take a structure, think about a mathematical structure in which you have all your attack routes or potential attack routes that you find out using your red team, using your technical risk assessment, using your security operations center that actually brought to your attention that there are some risks that are quite significant. Now you put all of those in a structure that is very measurable. You add numbers to it, calculating the risk. It's not easy, but it's definitely possible. And there are, let's say, several mechanisms and frameworks on how to do that. Then decision-making is much easier. You know, first, what is relevant to your organization? Second, what is the potential impact? And third, what should be the cybersecurity investment of your organization? And more than that, I can tell you that this process can be optimized. If that's interesting, I can definitely take you through a decision-making process based on graph theory algorithms, but that's a very technical discussion. If that's interesting, more than happy to do that. But that's definitely possible. People understand consequences.
Sure, thanks for that. Lavy, can we get your perspective on that same question on prioritizing threats and solutions?
I think I don't have a lot to add to what Reuven mentioned, because it's definitely it. But in order to prioritize, we have to build the infrastructure. We have to build the infrastructure within the organization in order to be able to decide the right decision in each and every aspect. So the infrastructure is meaning of algorithm of risk for each and every one of the aspects. So that, I think, the main goal for each and every CISO within his organization: build an infrastructure to provide the infrastructure and to explain the algorithm to all the stakeholders. And then after it, you're making a decision based on prioritization based on an algorithm that was reflect to all the stakeholders from the beginning.
Talk to us a little bit about the next generation capabilities of the hackers as well as the defenders, and the kind of security foundations that you would need to put into place to protect against those capabilities.
So there's a lot of aspect of next generation. I don't think that we are now in a stage when we're dealing efficiently with the current threats. We've seen what happened across the world. So organizations are shutting down around us on a daily work. We've seen huge enterprises that are shutting down. I think that the next generation, from the attacker's point of view, it's a phase of all the trend that we're seeing, the 5G and how we prepare for 5G trend. I don't think that anywhere across the world are mature enough to prepare to 5G trend yet. Although we invest in it, we try to explore it and started to build in our capability regarding that. But it's on the diaper, like I say, nowadays. The IoT is something that comes with a really robust way and come all over us, and we're starting to see incidents regarding IoTs. So if we're speaking of financial institute, in many cases, I hear also CISO of financial institute that are saying, IoT, I don't have any IoT, it's ain't belong to me. All my golden assets are located within my IT infrastructure. And then when a company like Rubi gets in the organization and manage to shut down the organization through a OT attack, it's bringing us to the understanding that we have to invest in it, not only in the relevant sector like energy, but also within financial organization. What we need to invest in order to be much better is, as I mentioned earlier, like the attacker are sharing and working together with one another. We, as a government, as organization, as industry, must work together much better. And I forgot one of the most important part of the puzzle: law enforcement. So law enforcement, government, the company themselves, and the industry must work together. And nowadays, they're not working together efficient enough. They're not open with one another to share what happened within the organization or to share capability. And nowadays, what we invest here in Israel is how to build in this framework of cooperation between us and the law enforcement across the world, the other agencies across the world, the industry, and the organization, trying building even the operational part. So I will give an example of what happened in Beersheba within the CERT. Within the CERT, we have 8 security operations center, a sectorial security operations center. One, we have the financial CERT. under the same building, under the same manager. The financial CERT, we have an energy CERT that monitor all the OT network of all the energy sector in Israel. We have one for the government that monitor all the government ministry. We have one for first responders. We have another one for communication and telecom. And we have another one to have a sensor from the actual market and the civilian. We have a center which he have an emergency phone number 119, that each and every civilian SMB big enterprise could reach out in case of cybersecurity. This whole ecosystem and fusion center under the same place bring us to the understanding that we have to work together in order to identify and detect the first sign of epidemic and share with the immunity with all the others. I think this is the key of when we look ahead. This is the key that we must invest in, how we working together in order to be much better than the other side that already understand that and act much more efficiently in that part.
I'm going to stay with you on that note, because there's a question that ties in with what you were saying earlier about collaboration. One of the audience members wants to know if there shouldn't be more collaboration between cloud service providers, ISPs and the like to counteract cyber criminals. Now, I know that in Europe, in the last 2 years, Kaspersky worked very closely with a range of players to deal with the ransomware epidemic that was sweeping Europe at the time. And they were very effective in countering that ransomware. Why aren't we seeing more of that? And why aren't we seeing the likes of AWS, Microsoft, Google and Oracle working closely together with their service providers and with governments, because this is such a global threat?
I think that eventually it's a matter of interest, but there's a lot of framework that is under construction. So, for example, I'm part of a framework led by the World Economic Forum. Try to build a framework of cooperation between the global partner that you mentioned, law enforcement on cyber domain, agencies, and industry, how to better combat in collaboration against those threats. There's the one that you mentioned, the normal ransom, that is led by Kaspersky and others, that is pretty efficient. I think that the past few months we come to realize and understand that the amount of attack that is solved, amount of ransomware attack that is solved by those initiatives will become much less because of the sophistication of the attacker. I think Rubi can explore more about it, but it's not enough. It's not enough because the attacker know how to better and build new capability in order to bypass, for example, that initiative. The lack of collaboration that we're seeing, and the reason why we see a lack of collaboration are in many cases from the obvious reason. Organization want to share his information and to be exposed to low risk or regulation risk. Each and every organization want to keep this information to himself. I think the challenge of organization like us is how to build the trust between those organizations to others, how to build the trust between them and ourselves. I will give an example how we try to do that and how we manage to do it in some sectors. So, for example, in Israel, we build a platform for info sharing named the CyberNet, which each and every organization can share information with other parties within the sector or with the general platform. He could share it in anonymous way. No one's eventually going to know who's been attacked and who's sharing the information. This is one hand, the anonymous part, which is a tactical aspect, but it's very efficient when we try to explain to the CEO and the CIO why we need to share this information and why we are on a zero risk regarding this information sharing. And of course, the TLP protocol, that eventually allow each and every organization to share his information with the trust that this information won't be shared with other parties. Here in Israel, the financial CERT becoming to be real efficient in that part, in building the trust within the sector. Even in an aspect of building the protocol with the regulator. So for example, a bank could share information with the financial CERT and could decide that this information won't be shared with the regulator, and we came to understanding with the regulator that there are some cases that we are not going to share the information with them. What happened practically when you build the trust, what happened in the practical level, that most of the banks or most of the financial institutes are more than willing to share this information with everyone. After you lower the threats regarding those kind of risks, you understand that eventually, in order to share information, it's much more, it's the benefit of sharing information between one another within the sector. It's much more, it had a huge benefits, because I'm coming from one of the financial organization in Israel in one of my previous role. And when I was there, in order to share information, even a tactical information regarding IOC or specific threats that even blocked within our security technology, in order to share it outside of the organization, I had to share it with one manager. He had to share it with another executive. He shared it with the CEO. And eventually, after 2 weeks, what the organization was willing to share are a line that doesn't say anything. So after you came to realize and building the trust with the management layer and with the executive part, that eventually this framework and this protocol will minimize the risk exposure of the organization to zero. So they're willing to let you be much more independent, even through the analyst and the CISO, much more independent of sharing information outside the organization.
Great. Fascinating insights. Before I ask the next question, which I think is going to be truly fascinating, so hold on to your seats there, I'd like to invite the audience to put any questions that they have into the Q&A box that's available on your Zoom interface. Ruby, I'd like to turn to you now to go inside the mind of the hacker, the theme of this event, and tell us what the hacker's perspective is of what Lavy was just telling us. And how does the hacker think in terms of scoping out what they're going to do next, and how are they going to attempt to penetrate? That is your job, in effect, to go inside the mind of the hacker and act like the hacker. So give us the hacker perspective.
So, you know, when we take an assignment, right, to actually work to get, let's say, some wins, let's call it, or specific achievements in an organization, we look at it like a military operation. That means we have specific goals. That means what we want to achieve. Then we are actually planning all the attack plan according to the results. That is a very results-driven concept, right? So you take into consideration a lot of the data that you can find out there before you even start the attack. Let me give you a very simple example, right? If you want to understand the cybersecurity capabilities of an organization, the only thing that you need to do, really to get a very good understanding, go to LinkedIn, search for the technical people of the organization. People are very proud to say what they are using, what they are doing, what are their capabilities, right, in their professional career. But based on that, you are actually able to draw a very clear picture of what is the cybersecurity situation of the organization. If you take it to the next level of a link analysis between people or organizations, then you can draw a very good situation, cybersecurity situation of the organization, and let's say adjust accordingly the evasion techniques that you need to do. And here I'm talking about more sophisticated attacks that we are trying to do. Usually, unfortunately, I will say that in a very unfortunate way, usually you don't need a lot in order to do that. And more than that, once you get the initial foothold, going from there and working sometimes in a very noisy way will be still very successful, and no one will be able to identify you. And even if you are identified, the response procedure that is then being taken to try and kick you out, that's something that, you know, the human brain always thinks that, I mean, we always want to be in a positive situation. So you want, you know, basic mental, you want just to understand that the attacker is not there anymore. So usually if we are, for example, getting on the radar of someone and someone is trying to kick us out, we are just lowering the profile, trying to keep everything silent. We wait for the organization to think that they were able to identify everything that we've done, and then we continue for the next time. That means 2 weeks later, for example, then you see the faces of the people that they were sure that they were able to identify you. They were sure that you're already out, and then you're going back in. That's something that usually can break someone mentally. Of course, that's not what we are trying to do, right? We're just trying to put a reflection of the reality of how those attackers are actually thinking on the regular basis. So when you take this kind of exercises, again, first thing that we do, goals, very clear goals and objectives. Second, understanding intelligence. That means we are exploring the organization, trying to understand what is relevant to the organization, and then drawing a very clear map of how we are going to attack the organization, what are the techniques. I'll maybe surprise you by saying that usually we are really looking for the basic things. I would love to get access to an organization using a password guessing process that maybe sounds less sexy than the next generation attack of artificial intelligence-based, I don't know, exploitation of a buffer overflow, right? That sounds much more sexy. But I can tell you that when you get access through a guessed password, the capability that you have in the organization to identify that usually, right, will be so low. And that will bring you to a very significant success in the organization before you need to use, let's say, the next generation capabilities. I have to say that we use next generation capabilities usually for social engineering. So I can tell you that we've developed capabilities around artificial intelligence-based social engineering. That means social media analysis, collection of information, and then targeting specific emails to specific people, which usually stays under the radar. That means that even if you attack an organization, you're not sending 500 emails that are the same email to all the relevant recipients in the organization, but different email per person that you are trying to attack. Those are usually very successful. Now, of course, we have capabilities, or we use capabilities that sometimes are more technology oriented. As I said, buffer overflow, 0 days, 1 days, and so on. But as I said, we prefer to use first basic capabilities, publicly available tools before we are going and actually using capabilities that we know that are going to be costly. One last consideration, just keep in mind, everything that we invested in developing, once it's out there, then practically this capability is lost. That means that tomorrow someone will be able to identify that, add some kind of signature, whether technical signature, behavioral signature, or whatever, and then this capability will be no longer relevant. So also keep in mind that even if you have a very powerful offensive organization, the assets of the organization, those are the tools, capabilities, vulnerabilities, and exploits that they are familiar with. They are not going to use each and every one of those at every attack that they are going to use. So you'll see more and more basic things rather than the advanced things that are sometimes harder to identify. But this is how we work. You're on mute, Arthur.
How does the IDF handle cybersecurity threats? I think that's a question on everyone's minds, because they must be one of the most attacked and threatened organizations in the world.
Yeah, that's true. When I was in the IDF, we experienced hundreds of attacks, not a week, but a minute. And that's something that I'm taking you back to what you just mentioned before about prioritization. Even if you are in a military organization that budget supposed to be a non-issue, it's still an issue. And that's something that you need to be able to prioritize. And, you know, with us, that we have all the kind neighbors that we have around us that are continuously struggling to help us improve our cybersecurity capabilities, then you need to be really in a situation where you're able first to identify, second, to respond accordingly, but before everything, to prevent everything that can be prevented. So if we need to look at the order, prevention is now #1 priority in the IDF and in general. If you can prevent it first. Then second will be detection. Detection on all the open things. Like, for example, if you have a disconnected air-gapped system, right, you shouldn't see any connection to it. And still you need to search for those connections, because if you see the connection, then something is wrong. This is one of assumptions that we see today in the commercial world, that you assume that your security capability or your security function that you put in place is so good that you don't need to monitor that. That's something that is a very common mistake that we see all around. So again, going back to the IDF, prevention first, detection and response going together. That means time to detect and time to respond at minimal. That means very sophisticated capabilities around detection and response, and the best quality in manpower. I think that you can see in the IDF something that is quite unique for the Israeli nation. The training process starts from high school, sometimes even before that. Then you train people to be really excellent. Then you provide them with 3 to 6 years working in their specific profession, which makes them best of class, let's say experts. And then when they are going to the outside world, whether it's 8200 cybersecurity unit or any other unit in the army, you get talents in a level that is quite significant. That's why you see so many startups. That's why you see someone like Lavy that is taking an initiative and working with the government to actually help the society in Israel, which is, from my point of view, an admire. You need to admire these things when you see them, because he has a lot of opportunities outside, and working in this government organization, that's definitely something that he sacrifices from himself and from his, of course, unique professional knowledge. So that's something that you see in the state of Israel quite a lot.
Thanks, Ruby. At the other end of the scale, Lavy, if I can turn to you now, looking at the average citizen, how are cybercrime attacks and scams handled when you're looking at the threats to ordinary citizens and also how to help them respond?
So when we are looking at the Israeli cybersphere, we try to divide a few operations. First of all, and what's one of the things that is most important is to make sure that the critical infrastructure in Israel will keep safe. So we invest most of our capability and our workforce in order to keep the critical infrastructure in Israel. And critical infrastructure is a meaning by providing the civilians eventually the trust of providing all the essential services. So providing essential services within the healthcare, energy, and other, even trust across the financial organization. Then we'll go around, and for that, for example, we invest for each and every critical infrastructure organization. We invest with a specific manpower. It's called guidance that eventually will build and help them build in their security infrastructure. The other part is all the rest. We call them Organization A. All the rest, we provide guidance through the regulator, for one hand. So for example, we provide guidance to the banking supervision, and they're providing regulation across the sector. For other hand, we have the operational part, which is within the national CERT, which is try to bring an operational capability to the sector. So operational capability to the financial organization are provided through the CERT. As for civilian, I think the main goal for us is to provide a safe ecosystem and safe environment in order to keep the trust of the government, the trust from the democratic ecosystem, which is now very important across the world. Things like fake news and others are things that try to break the trust from the public to the government, and from the public to other organizations across the world. And in order to do that, we try to deal with each and every incident that civilians are sharing with us with the right amount of severity. I can mention that we're getting more than 100 of reports a day from civilians to the 119 operation. We managed to provide value, an actual value, to those reporters, and even in the cases of things that are very severe to the civilian and not that severe for us, we managed to bring the trust and solution for that part. And I will give an example. Either though it's not a pure cyber, in many cases, you all know the sextortion alert that happen all across the world. Within the sextortion or even ransomware incident, when we're getting all those reports, we manage to understand and to answer the reporter if it's a real threat or it's just a fake threat that try to use and exploit low-hanging fruit. In some cases, we even manage to share decryption key from ransomware attack. So we're getting first a report about ransomware attack. Maybe that organization is already paid for the attacker, and the info sharing aspect of taking those keys and sharing with all the rest is the value that we provide. In other cases, we provide value even in trying to help them with the phishing email that they're getting. We help with phishing sites. We take down of phishing site and using the collaboration and connection that we have with other CERT and other organizations across the world. We're using our connection with other stakeholders, the Israeli industry. In many cases, even after we are getting a report about an incident, that we don't want to deploy our own incident response team, because we have incident response team that we can deploy in a case of a severe case, in case of the attacker is a nation state attack, or if it's regarding critical infrastructure, or if it's an epidemic. If it's not one of those three, we also, for example, manage to help them by giving them the details of Israeli security incident response team, and try to help them on the first steps around the incident response and around the cyber threats. And that operation give to the civilians and organization, SMB or big enterprise, the security and understanding that they have someone that they can reach out, they have an address, and eventually to keep the trust from civilian, government, and other organizations.
Right. I'm going to ask both of you your last questions now before we wrap up. So I'll just stay with you first, Lavy, just following on from what you were just saying. If you could just summarize, you've got programs to share information with banks at the CERT. How would you be able to assist South African banks in that regard?
So that's a great question. We within the financial CERT, we understand that the power comes from collaboration, and we would like to have as much as a strong partner as we can. We share information and build an infrastructure of sharing information and collaboration with many US banks, with many banks across Europe, and of course we are more than open to share information with banks from other regions as well. So I'm invited everyone, I will share the details afterward, but I invited everyone building the connection with the Israeli CERT, getting the reports, sharing information and sharing threats that they're seeing around those areas. And in some cases with a more mature partnership, we also conduct automated info sharing aspect and a mutual workforce. So building a relationship with the Israeli financial CERT is more than welcome, especially from that region.
Thanks a lot, Lavy. And then to Ruby, the last question I wanted to ask you is, what new threats do you see emerging, or new techniques rather, in the COVID-19 era?
So I think that the main thing that's worth mentioning is the shifting to, let's say, home environment attack. One thing that we've seen lately, by the way, and that's something that will be probably much more famous in the near future. One of the, let's call it challenges that you have today as an employer, for example, in Europe, is regarding the fact that you are asking your employees, for example, to work all day long with their camera turned on, just as an example. Now, what happens in a case that you have like a privacy breach? In easy cases, your children are just playing behind you in the background, then practically their information, faces, and so on is exposed. But in more severe cases, we found we have now a specific case that we are dealing with in which one employee is actually suing the organization because his wife got out of the shower, and he blamed the organization by saying, "You forced to do that. I didn't want to be with my camera open." And now it takes you to a new concept of risk, right? Coming from, again, GDPR, privacy, and working from home. That means that you are starting to leverage personal infrastructure for the company good, right? And that's something that is not that clear. Where are the borders, right? So privacy is only the first issue. Let's assume now that you have someone was able to get access to your ADSL route based only on, let's say, very simple password guessing, which usually is very easy with those routers with the telecom providers that you see today. Now you have someone that is able to get access to the organizational network practically, right? Because then you have active VPN connection usually to the organization. Someone is sitting with you in the same network. Usually you don't see like a full tunnel working in the organization. That means that you are able to have more than one connection to your network and to the organizational network. And you are now dealing as an organization with hundreds, thousands, or more than that of connections to your organization, that each and every one of those connections is a potential network and not only one single PC. We see now more and more attacks are actually trying to leverage that, working mainly through personal email addresses. We've seen 7 attacks since the beginning of July, 7 attacks, different attacks that started with a phishing attack against a personal email of someone that is considered, let's say, a VIP in the organization, either C-level executive or VP in a higher rank. That's something that, again, is not taken care of at the moment in the right way, organizational wide. And we see that the consequences from this initial foothold, of course, you need to do much more after the initial foothold. I mean, only single mistake is not good enough, let's say, in order to create, in most cases, significant damage to the organization. But we see that those mistakes are repeating. For example, password reuse, right? You see that once you get access to a personal device, you are able to extract username passwords or hashes from memory. You see that, for example, still local admins or users that are being used for backup, which is part of the security ecosystem, are actually reused among different devices. So you are able to move laterally in the organization in a very, let's say, easy and harder to detect way. And you find yourself as a defending organization or as a security organization in the organization trying to fight the wind because you don't know where this is going to attack you from, and also what is illegitimate, because most of the sessions that you see looks like legitimate sessions. And those are things that, that we see more and more emerging. More than that, I can tell you that password-based attacks are always relevant, but lately we see a huge increase in attacks that are, again, very simple. Password spraying and password brute forcing, mainly around password spraying, which is more a relevant technique at the moment. And that's something that we see that once Office 365, usually, that's what we see, at least in the attacks that we manage lately. We see that once a Office 365 account is compromised, then from there, you see very interesting techniques using, for example, SharePoint and OneDrive in order to share a malware in the organization and actually populate to not only inside the organization, but also all the connections of the organization. So, for example, just to give you the scenario, target a salesperson, compromise the salesperson environment, but then send yourself to all of these contacts with a specific link to your organization environment, to your SharePoint or OneDrive. That's something that we've seen quite a lot lately, and it's highly successful. So again, very basic. All of the things are basic. You can identify each and every one of the steps and still highly efficient. And those are the things that I'm concerned about more than those things that are more, let's say, imaginary, or some things that are more James Bond oriented concepts that you, with 3 lines of code, you are able to get access into the nuclear facility of every country, right? So those are the items that I'm at least from my point of view, are very relevant.
Thank you. That's very sobering. Thanks so much, Rubi and Lavy. Those are fascinating insights, also severely sobering insights. And I'm going to sum up the discussion today with three words. It's an ABC summary I'm going to give you. The A is for personal. I know personal doesn't start with an A, but the Hebrew for I is ani, which is the A of this, and it starts with I. We individually are responsible for cybersecurity. The B is basics. We've got to get the basics right. And the C is collaboration. Collaboration is critical on a global level to fight off the cyber threat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arthur, and thanks for everyone for attending to this event, and thank you, Lavy and Rubi for this. I would like to thank again for SABRIC for the collaborations and for Alon. We will send all of the attendees the recording of the webinar, and you're more than welcome to approach us if you want any context for the speakers to talk with them, or for other technologies and trends. You can also look for us, put on Google Israeli trade mission to South Africa, and approach us through our website. Thank you very much and have a good day.